welcome to Left Reckoning. I'm your host, Matt Leck. It's kind of a little bit of an extension of Matt May, actually, a remainder edition. David is actually here in New York for a book party because his book is coming out next fall, so that is on our agenda for this evening. But we have two great interviews. Adam Gaffney first on a new study that shows the human cost of these Medicaid cuts that are in the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, and Hannah Habtu talking about Tigray and genocidal violence there. So patreon.com/Left Reckoning. No post game. We will do another summer post game next week. David will be back, but check out these interviews and links down below. Welcome, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck, and joining me today, I'm happy to be talking to Dr. Adam Gaffney. He's a pulmonary and ICU doctor at Cambridge Health Alliance, assistant professor at Harvard Med, and a healthcare researcher. Adam, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
And well, we have a good, interesting paper that you and several others have been working on here, and this in the context of the Republican push to cut Medicaid. They are calling it waste, fraud, and abuse. I think how I would say those terms are relevant are they are frauds and abusers that are wasting people. And to kind of put the actual numbers to that, you have this paper out titled Projected Effects of Proposed Cuts in Federal Medicaid Expenditures on Medicaid Enrollment, Uninsurance, Healthcare, and Health. So before we get to these sort of policy avenues that look pretty disastrous that the Republicans want to take, for folks, what is Medicaid?
It's a fair question, and I think it's good to kind of go back to those fundamentals to understand what's at risk and who's at risk. So, look, we all know the United States doesn't have a universal health care program, and there actually was a push for what we would now term national health insurance in the post-war era. That was defeated. And its architects kind of narrowed their vision in subsequent decades to what became Medicare, which is a public health insurance program that covers the elderly. And that was signed into law during the Civil Rights era, 1965. And it's sometimes described as something of almost a oversight, or not an oversight, but a sort of side part of the bill was Medicaid. And so Medicaid was signed into law at the same time. It is a public health insurance program that covers lower income Americans. And when it was first passed, it wasn't just enough to be low income. You also had to fall into one of these, categories that was associated with receiving cash benefits for relief. Over the decades, since 1965 to more recent years, Medicaid has expanded enormously. The ACA, for instance, the Affordable Care Act, made it such that anyone below a certain income, even if they didn't fall into one of those categories, became eligible. So over time, Medicaid grew, and it now covers over 70 million lower income Americans. It covers a very high share of births. It covers many people with disabilities and chronic illnesses. And so it really, in the United States, a country that lacks universal health care, it functions as something of the foundations of our healthcare safety net, which isn't to say it doesn't have shortcomings, and it might be worth talking about that at some point, what it doesn't do. But that's kind of why it matters.
And just like Medicare, although maybe slightly less so, at least in public understanding, politically, popular.
When you survey people, even across the political spectrum, you'd be almost surprised to see how popular Medicare and Medicaid are. In fact, all of our health programs and even our research institutes command high support across the political spectrum, which makes what's happening now, particularly surprising. But yes, now on the other hand, I will say over time, politicians have felt much more comfortable going after Medicaid, narrowing benefits, kicking people off. Because unlike Medicare, where it's everyone 65 and older automatically is eligible, Medicaid is a federal state program. Each state has a lot of leeway to define who is covered and what is covered. And that gives politicians more room politically and from a policy perspective to squeeze it. Also, because it is a program that covers lower income people who don't often have as much political power in our system, unfortunately.
Yeah. So what is the sort of methodology you use to look at this issue?
Yes. So what we do is we combine projections on how many people would lose health insurance, which are mostly coming from the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan body that makes and analyzes legislation. It's sort of Congress's official scorekeeper. And we combine that with prior studies on the health impacts of coverage expansion and coverage contraction, meaning there's been a large body of evidence that shows that having health insurance matters. Being uninsured is dangerous because we're not the CBO is focused on dollars and cents. I'm a physician researcher. I care mostly about health. And so we wanted to look at the health impacts. Now, I think the general public, it's sort of common sense that if you don't have health care, that's not good for your health. But it still has been studied for decades. And so we bring in quasi-experimental and even experimental studies that basically randomize people to health coverage or not to put a number on what kind of care are people not going to get, what sorts of access is going to change, how will people's self-rated health change, and the big one is how many people will die.
Absolutely. And the logic of you're removing people from health insurance seems pretty unassailable, and the sort of hand waving that conservatives make, well, they'll find some other insurance, even though, they won't. That still kind of proves a point of, yeah, it's bad to kick people off health insurance, isn't it? And like you say, in deaths is one metric that we can predict based on this information that you're putting against the CBO score. So some of these policy options, as this budget bill sort of looks toward, and I mean, with the way these things work, sometimes people might think, oh, once this gets to the Senate, maybe some of the hard edges might get deliberated out. But I think you're not optimistic about that likelihood before we get into these individual policies.
No, I'm not. And, as we're recording this, the Senate is prepared to release legislative text. So what we have so far is the House bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed by the House on May 22nd. Today is June 16th, and we are shortly going to see what the Senate is doing on its end. And I think there was some hope that, well, these sort of Senate moderates are going to be less interested in cutting Medicaid because it's politically toxic. And the early reports is the cuts are going to be just as deep and maybe even deeper. And part of the reason for that, and we'll get into these different specific cuts in a minute, part of the reason for that is that they have coalesced around one provision that will be the biggest driver of coverage losses, and that's the Medicaid work requirements. So it'll be worth fleshing that out. But it seems like insofar as there is some tension or disagreement, it's not really about the biggest provision that will do the most harm.
Yeah, I mean, let's start maybe with that work requirements one. It's not the first that you get into, and we'll try to get to all these, but talk about the work requirements.
Yeah, it's not the first, but I will say when we started this project, you're probably aware things take a while to get through the peer review process. So we started this well before we knew what would be in the legislative texts, which is why we covered a number of different provisions that were being discussed as, let's say in January. Ultimately, we were able to include estimates of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in the sort of final stages. But putting that aside, the biggest provision in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that will take away health coverage from people are work requirements. So what are work requirements? Why is it that they actually do poll somewhat favorably among the American public, but are so harmful? So Medicaid is a health program, okay? That is the design of Medicaid. That is what it is supposed to do under law. And so throughout its history, despite many problems with it, requiring people to work or to show reasons why they're not working was never a part of the game. That changed in the first Trump administration. They approved waivers. So these are sort of like experiments that states are allowed to submit, waivers to 13 states that would allow them to impose these requirements and to disenroll people who didn't jump through the hoops. Only one state did it during the Trump administration in terms of actually kicking people off. That was the state of Arkansas. It only applied, and this is important because you'll see why these Medicaid work requirements are far worse than anything that's actually been done. They only applied to people 40 to 54 years of age, so somewhat narrow age group. And within the year that they were implemented, 18,000 people lost health insurance. Why is that? Well, these are complicated. They require setting up accounts, documenting different requirements. They've caused a lot of confusion among the public. And these are individuals who are often have a lot of things going on in their life. I mean, I would struggle to, I think, jump through the hoops and for myself, and I'm a health policy person, and I have many advantages, of course. If you could imagine being chronically ill, having constraints on your financial resources, having constraints on your time, that it could be really difficult to do all this. And so they didn't. People fell through the cracks. And the reality is that the number of people who lost health insurance, who lost Medicaid, is far greater than what should have happened if it had only been people who didn't meet the requirements. So basically what that means is red tape. It's a red tape situation. And that's how work requirements save money. There's something about it that saves money. Now, what came out of that are two studies that showed the exact same thing. And they have a lot of pertinence to what we're talking about. Both of them showed that, first off, the people who lost coverage did not get other coverage. So when Republicans say they'll get private health insurance, I find that unrealistic just in terms of the reality of how the world works. But that's actually not what either of these well-done studies showed. In fact, they showed almost one-to-one increase in uninsurance for a number of people who lost Medicaid. Number two, they didn't show any actual benefit in terms of people going to work. There was no labor market impacts. Maybe I'm going too much in depth for that, but I think that's important to understand. These requirements would apply to people 19 to 64. They would require people to both demonstrate eligibility or falling into some exemption category to sign up initially and to stay enrolled. They would also, this bill would increase the frequency of which you had to show documentation to maintain an enrollment from annually to every 6 months. That would also lose health coverage. And the funny thing about this whole thing from the perspective of efficiency, waste, fraud, and abuse, as you said, is these programs are administratively extremely wasteful. There's this whole article, Georgia sort of late in the game did its work requirements thing just in the last couple of years. And they've spent more than 80% of the total money on their program has just gone to corporate consultants and IT and bureaucracy, not to healthcare. So anyway, long way of saying it's a lot of waste. It's a lot of your bureaucracy. It's a lot of administration. And the end result is people being kicked out of the program, and a lot of people. And it's the biggest cost saver, so to speak, in the BB.
Yeah, and I think Matt Brunig has called them paperwork requirements. And I remember before I'm thankfully on employer insurance now, I hated the Obama marketplace every year. It's just a drag to have to do that. That was not an exciting shopping experience. Let's move to another one of these policies here currently. How about the Medicaid per capita cuts?
So that is not in the bill. That is something that goes back to the Reagan era, the idea of block granting Medicaid. So that would be huge in terms of its impacts. Again, that ultimately they didn't include that. They didn't, I think they were worried about the political fallout. But despite that, they still managed to cut Medicaid by as much as that would have done by combining, rather than one big thing, lots of these little things. So it's a little more, I don't want to say death by 1,000 cuts, but death by one or two big ones and a bunch of smaller ones.
Which of the other big ones do you think is worth emphasizing here? I mean, I think the Medicaid expansion is another one I've been hearing a lot about.
Right. So it mentioned at the beginning of the show, the Affordable Care Act signed into law by Obama, basically made it such that, non-elderly adults who had low incomes could sign up for Medicaid, even if they didn't fall into one of those categories. And that expanded Medicaid by a lot. And the federal government made it sort of attractive to states by funding most of the cost of that. Only states had to cover 10% of the cost. Usually they need to cover more of the Medicaid pop. So Republicans have talked for a while about sort of getting rid of that boosted funding, which would mean that states would just get a lot less money from Medicaid and they would have to cut people from the program. The bill doesn't directly do that, but it does affect Medicaid expansion in a couple different ways, one of which is really pernicious and I find really disturbing. So, the fact is that there are undocumented immigrants in this country and they need health care. And decent people know that. Doctors and nurses take care of these patients, and they should. The alternative is letting people die in the streets. Now, you can't cover undocumented.
Sorry to interrupt, but can I just add, that's not good for public health either. Generally.
It's not good for public health.
I'm not a doctor.
No, it's not good for public health, nor do I think, and not only that, this is not my work, but work from some colleagues of mine, have looked at the fact that immigrants, both undocumented and documented, tend to not use a lot of healthcare. They tend to be relatively young and healthy and probably be pushed out of the healthcare system in ways that are not right. But putting that aside, they actually pay, on average, more into our public and private health insurance programs than they use in benefits. So even if you are a heartless person who just said, I don't care, it actually turns out that immigrants subsidize our health insurance programs, including undocumented immigrants. So there's no economic case. There's no medical ethical case. And as you said, no, there's not a public health case. I mean, people, as you said, you obviously want to treat people early. You want to treat them and diagnose contagious illnesses and other processes before they get worse. So yes, so that's in agreement. And so what this bill, so states can't actually cover, the federal government does not spend $1 on the care of undocumented immigrants. States are allowed to do that totally internally with just their internal funds to use some money to give some care to some undocumented immigrants, which, and again, where I stand on that is clear.
Yeah.
What this bill would do is it would basically penalize states that did that. Even though there was no federal dollars going to it, it would ratchet down payments to states that have the ACA Medicaid expansion and use some of their own internal funds for these patients. And they don't. And so that's a way it sort of affects that issue without directly cutting it.
And so broadly speaking, there's these number of different possibilities, but millions of people will be losing health insurance if this passes.
That's right. So the Congressional Budget Office has final estimates we have for the BBB. So from the Medicaid cuts alone, you are talking about more than 7 million people not only losing Medicaid, but not finding alternative coverage. The Affordable Care Act marketplaces that have some of the issues that you mentioned with the difficulty of signing up and so forth, well, it would make that worse. And so the bill would also make some of those processes even more difficult. That would mean another, and we don't look at that. We look at just Medicaid. That would mean another 3 million people losing health insurance. And on top of that, the ACA marketplace premium subsidy, those boosted subsidies to make those insurance plans cheaper that got initially passed during the COVID pandemic. Those are set to expire at the end of this year, even without legislation. So, if you add up all those numbers, you're talking about a potentially historic increase in the number of people who are uninsured. And don't forget, there's already about 25 million people uninsured. So we are looking at a potentially huge increase in the number of Americans who don't get health care, who don't have access to health care. And the consequences are going to be terrific, terrible.
Yeah. And just the millions, that's something I've been emphasizing. Like, obviously, I think I don't need to be sold on the economics of these things. But it's also just insanely foolish to me. We are choosing to instead of investing all these dollars towards healthcare and getting people to see doctors, we're giving a tax cut to rich people. And again, like, even if you are a heartless person that doesn't want poor people to get care or whatever, that's still money that's not going into the healthcare system that would be keeping hospitals and clinics and stuff afloat. And instead we're just going to say, well, you don't need that business. It just seems so insane to me.
Some of these shifts in policy, and even zooming out for a second, looking at other things we're seeing, like slashing NIH research, putting whole universities under sort of blanket barricades and in terms of funding, public health defunding of things like the CDC. Yes, these are so short-sighted, right? We are all going to, if we don't currently face serious health issues, we will one day, all of us, and we will wish that there had been good medical research that makes better therapies for our illnesses. But I agree. And I think there is awareness among this when you read the Republican reports. They are somewhat rhetorically concerned about hospital closures, for instance. But the reality is, talk is cheap, right? So this bill would cut out about more than $700 billion in spending on Medicaid over a decade, and about $300 billion. Did I say $700 billion? More than $700 billion, $300 billion on Affordable Care Act marketplaces. So you're talking about $1 trillion taken out of healthcare over a decade. And of course, that there are hospitals that treat poorer communities and in rural areas that cannot sustain those kinds of reductions. They may already be operating on the margin of profitability, and this could result in them cutting services, cutting staff, or even closing. And so that will impact patients even outside of the group that's covered or not covered as a result of these cuts. So yes, I agree. And as you say, just to repeat it, and for what aim, for what goal, for what purpose are we doing these cuts? For tax cuts that predominantly benefit the wealthiest Americans. It's a redistribution of healthcare into the pockets of wealthy for tax cuts. And that's as simple as it is.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the sort of maybe shortcomings of Medicaid and what should be done to, strengthen it. I'm curious what comes to mind on that. And also, were you somebody who thought that Medicaid for all was a better slogan than Medicare for all, or a more appropriate one? Or where do you stand on that sort of positioning?
So I think to answer that question, we have to first say what kind of healthcare system we want in the best of all worlds. And for me, it's one healthcare system that takes care of everyone and to the extent possible provides first dollar care and doesn't treat people differently based on class or race, ethnicity, and everything like that. So you need one plan to do that. The problem with a program like Medicaid, that is, again, we need to fight tooth and nail to prevent this from happening. But the problem with it is threefold. First, it's a federal state program, as I said, and that has allowed states over time to do very different things with it. My state, Massachusetts, has a pretty darn good Medicaid program in terms of the comparisons. But other states have much narrower ones. They deny coverage to people more frequently. And there have been times when states have restricted access to a certain number of prescription drugs, that kind of thing, under Medicaid. So it has often faced austerity type of politics. And part of the reason for that is because it's not universal. It's much harder to go at a program that covers people across the economic spectrum, like Medicare or like universal programs in Canada or Europe, than it's much easier to go after the programs that are relied upon by poor people. Now, if that was the only issue, that's more of a political issue. But the policy side of that is that Medicaid pays providers much less on average than other payers. And whatever you think about that from a sort of theoretical perspective, we know what the ramifications of that are going to be, right? That access is lower, that patients with Medicaid in some places, and this isn't true everywhere, might not have access to the same doctors and the same hospitals and the same services in some cases. Now, Medicaid is good in that it doesn't have much in the way of out-of-dollar costs, so out-of-pocket costs. So, you're not paying those high deductibles that private people with private insurance have. But there are disparities in access, those inequities that are inevitable when you have this sort of multi-tiered system. The final point I'd make about Medicaid is, in terms of its shortcomings, is that it's means tested, right? There's a certain income that you have to make. So imagine if you're someone who doesn't have the most stable income, you're going to be coming in and out of the program. Researchers call that churn. So there's a lot of Medicaid churn. People gain eligibility or lose eligibility. And then there's also problems with proving that you're still eligible. And that even though this bill would make that far worse because of things like work requirements and the other things we discussed, it's already a problem that people often don't fill out the paperwork on time and they find themselves uninsured. I want a program that covers people, all people, through the lifespan seamlessly and continuously. And so I think those are the shortcomings of Medicaid. So we should keep that in mind when we're envisioning what comes next, what comes after this current dark moment. And it's important to fight the current battle and to know what you're against, but we have to have something that we're for as well.
Yeah, and what victory will ultimately look like. Well, Adam Gaffney, people should follow you, AW Gaffney on Twitter. I won't say X. Are you on Blue Sky?
I have an account. I can't say it's a very active one.
It's not a habit yet. Okay, good. Well,
it's.
Yeah, well, we'll link to the article which came out yesterday, and again, thanks so much for talking about this and all your work on this. I mean, civilizationally important issue that we're wrestling with.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt. Take care.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. No David this interview, but joining me in case you were under the impression that there's only one target of genocidal violence that Biden and Trump are willing to officially overlook, my next guest is here to disabuse you of that notion. Hannah Habtu, freelance writer. Hannah, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
It's great to have you, and we've been talking about doing this for a long time, so I'm glad we finally got to it. Just introduce yourself before we get into Tigray, your background.
I am a Tigrayan American activist and writer and trying to kind of branch out into journalism. And I didn't think I would get into activism. I was more interested years ago in the mental health, I don't want to say industry, but sector, right, I guess would be a better way to put it. But this horrifying, unimaginable tragedy happened to me and my family and our people. So I've always loved politics, so I guess it kind of makes sense that this is the direction that I went into. But I feel compelled and an enormous duty to do this for my family and for my people.
And just for my purposes, I had been saying Tigray for the longest time, and then I watched some particularly British speakers say Tigray. Which do you prefer?
There's actually another kind of smaller ethnic group within northern Eritrea called Tigray. And it's a completely different people. Tigray is how we pronounce it. That's the correct pronunciation.
Gotcha. Okay. So, and I'll put up a map here for folks, just for folks who need the benefit of this here. But here in northern Ethiopia, south of the official border of Eritrea. So, with this, situate Ethiopia a little bit before we get into the history geographically, anything worth emphasizing?
So Ethiopia is, since the partitioning of Eritrea, a completely landlocked country, and it borders Sudan, Eritrea, Kenya, Somalia, and Tigray is the most northernmost region of Ethiopia. And we share the same ethnic group as a large swath of the Eritrean populace, even though there are 8 kind of smaller ethnic groups too, but majority of them are the same people as us. We were one people before the partition in 1890.
And let's talk about that. Maybe that's a good place to start on the historical situation of Ethiopia. We had Milton Alamadi on talking about, the 80s a little bit. So I guess that might be a good sort of precursor to this, but, start wherever you want about the historical situation for Ethiopia.
So Ethiopia can be described as an empire. I think it's more accurate to think of it as a consolidation of different ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups. There are over 80 recognized ethnic groups, over 70, I believe, recognized linguistic groups. And probably the most important distinction in understanding this is the Semitic versus the Cushitic people. So the Semitic would be obviously the Amharas, the Tigrayans, and the Cushitic would be the Oromos, would be the Somalis with Ethiopian citizenship, and a wide range of others, but those are the most important ones to keep in mind when you want to understand that distinction. And when Ethiopia was kind of consolidating into this political being, the Semitic groups, more specifically the Amharas, had kind of a colonial relationship with some of the other ethnic and linguistic groups, like in the southern of Ethiopia, who are not called Habesha. And there's kind of a tacit understanding that if these groups become Amharanized, learn Amharic, take on the official language of what would become the Ethiopian state, the Orthodox Church, life would be better for them. And so in that sense, I guess it is an empire. It's a complicated story, and it kind of gave birth to the conflict that we have now. And I think the most important thing to understand about it is it's defined by Amhara supremacy. Since the 1270s, Amharas were the dominant kind of running the show, running the empire. And the conflict comes when that were to change. Like when the Tigrayans took back, which I'll talk more about later, took back power in the state in 91, and their kind of coalition ruled for 27 years. That was a big source of the conflict that leads to where we are now.
Yeah, and you can fill in the just painting with broad brushstrokes here. We have basically Emperor Haile Selassie, ruler of Ethiopia for much of Selassie for much of the 20th century, overthrown by the Durg in 1974. And then, like you mentioned, the TPLF deposed him after about 15 years. So let's talk about that switch maybe briefly between Selassie and the Durg.
In many ways, prior to the Durg, Ethiopia was a feudal monarchy. So the royal family had almost absolute power. I guess you could, in a parallel that might make Western audiences understand it a little bit more, would be like the Russians getting rid of the Romanovs and taking on Marxism. Because the Durg was a very violent totalitarian. Mengistu Haile Mariam took back control of the state in a military coup and killed many of the people who rose to power with him, and quickly nationalized everything from land to means of production, even private homes. And it was a very, very traumatic time that really, really made such an impact in the Ethiopian DNA. And part of where this comes in was when Haile Selassie was removed from power, when he was killed in 74. Shortly after that, they created TPLF, which was a political movement that was about liberation, about advocating for Tigrayan people after being oppressed by Ethiopian empire, for lack of a better term. And so the whole caricature of the Tigray rebels comes from because the military infrastructure that was part of TPLF was in guerrilla warfare with the federal government for 17 years. And that's ultimately what rescued Ethiopia from the Durg.
And so this is where Tigray's sort of prominence comes from politically, is that violent struggle with the Durg and ultimately...
Exactly. And the Tigrayan people have always kind of had a reputation for being really formidable fighters. You know, when all things are considered, the militarism is really what partly define the movement.
Right. And before we get to this, fast forward to the modern conflict here. Now, let's just, there's two figures here. Let's start with Eritrea and Isaias Afwerki.
Isaias Afwerki.
Isaias Afwerki, yeah.
Isaias Afwerki was kind of this larger-than-life figure that helped rule the Eritrean People's Liberation Front and kind of this bitter, bloody struggle for independence for Eritrea. You have to understand how a figure could come up in the context of the history of Eritrea. Eritrea was partitioned by King Menelik in 1890, and the whole purpose for Eritrea existing was to divide the Tigrinya-speaking people. And so that's why the Tigrinya-speaking people remained as Tigrayans in Ethiopia, and the ones that were partitioned off into Eritrea became Eritreans. And they were colonized by the Italians, and then when the Italians lost World War II, briefly the British, and then the international community kind of sanctioned them becoming a fully independent state. I think that's what most of the people wanted. I don't know if they would still want that at this point. And so there is a lot of brokenness in that society. And the bolstering up of this autocrat, he ruled EPLF, and that became PFDJ, People for Democracy and Justice, which is a cult. I mean, it's literally, Eritrea now is called the North Korea of Africa. The deification of the leadership, the complete just erosion of all civil liberties. There's, required military conscription that it's very, very difficult to get out of. And this kind of madman taking over in 91, getting rid of the Constitution, getting rid of all civil liberties, getting rid of religious liberties. The mass psychosis of that society kind of led to the actions attributed to them in the genocide. Also, a really, really important thing that kind of characterizes the PFDJ universe is the hate for the Tigrayan. They were taught for two major reasons. There was a border war in 98, and Tigray borders Eritrea. So much of the military confrontation came from TPLF soldiers. So the brainwashing in that society came from that. And also Eritrea was a state that was destabilizing the Horn because they were funding militant groups such as Al-Shabaab from Somalia. And so the TPLF government put a complete sanction, economically and otherwise, on Eritrea. And so at the height of the genocide, when a lot of the Eritrean soldiers were raping, murdering, looting, destroying Tigray's way of life, they said, "You made us poor, so we made you, so we will destroy you for 40 or 50 years." That was a direct quote from a soldier. So it's a very difficult situation because there's so many pathologies involved, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is the situation here in terms. I mean, we already just said geographically, we have Afwerki to the north in Eritrea.
Whose mother's from Tigray. It's self-hate.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
And so now let's move to Abiy Ahmed.
Abiy Ahmed.
And I'm also curious, like in Ethiopia, the sort of Ahmed, like the sort of relationship with the TPLF over this 20 years here leading up to the war in 2020.
So starting from the beginning with Ahmed, he is a deeply disturbed person who has this belief, this grandiose belief that God wants me to be the seventh king of Ethiopia, and he sees Tigrayan nationalism as maybe the only impediment to that, the biggest impediment to that. And so especially like Oromos who may have their gripes of how the administration was run with TPLF rule, it feeds into this like scapegoating and vilification of Tigrayans as people. And also, I want to add one thing. The vilification, making a boogeyman out of TPLF, is so deeply ingrained in many people in Ethiopia, in the leadership, in the public, and people use it as a fig leaf, right, to justify, murdering Tigrayans in that name. We have to get rid of TPLF if civilians die,
I mean, we can see that sort of rhetoric of this is militant people, prone to violence. So
yeah, and I think
visit violence upon them.
That's why I think the whole caricature of Tigrayans as rebels is problematic. Because I don't think everyone who studies the region or whatever means it in that context, but I think that's the notion becomes that way. It becomes a justification for unspeakable things.
Yeah, I mean, in the American context, at least for me, the rebels aren't the good guys when it comes to like the Civil War, for instance. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this, especially the toll it's taken. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties here on the. Yeah, go ahead.
We need to talk more about who Abiy Ahmed is. Yeah. He is of mixed heritage. His mother was Amhara. His dad was Oromo, but grew up in Oromia. Speaks Oromo, speaks Amharic too, but very much went into politics under Oromo nationalism. Not really he colluded with the Amhara establishment later, but kind of made his bones as an Oromo nationalist. And what were you saying? We can go to the next question.
Well, so in 2022, violence, a war officially breaks out, and that's the
2020.
Of 2020. What did I say? Yeah, called the Forgotten War in quotes from 2020 to 2022. Talk about the toll of that. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people killed.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand it as not a war in the traditional sense, as in a vehicle to destroy the Tigrayan people. Abiy Ahmed got the Nobel Peace Prize for apparently being conciliatory towards Eritrea when there's a long, long history and conflict there. But there are New York Times reports that have been corroborated by other reports that he met with him 14 times as a way to plan the siege and the destruction of Tigray and Tigrayan people. They were never conciliatory for the sake of peace. It was to destroy Tigray. They both had deep, deep grievances with TPLF, the Tigrayan political structure, and by extension, all Tigrayans, for different reasons. So they came together, they coalesced around a common enemy, Tigray. And the preparations were made. This wasn't just a spur of the moment, conflict broke out. They were blocking the roads and making preparations to lay siege for the entire region, 6 to 7 million people, since 2018. And it's really, you have to understand that the actions TDF took, and I'm sure there were maybe individual violations on both sides, but it was an existential war of survival for us. Tigray was completely surrounded. They invited Eritrea to come and loot and rape and kill and destroy civilization in Tigray. They invited soldiers from Somalia proper, not just Somalis with Ethiopian citizenship. It was a long contemplated act of the destruction of 6 to 7 million people. There were many, many parts of it. And I think a really important feature of genocide is ethnic cleansing. And that's what Western Tigray was. Capturing Western Tigray, which is about 40% of the surface area of Tigray, was a really, really critical move for Amhara nationalists and Amhara supremacists. And it was also about erasing Tigrayan peoplehood. They started arresting people to have a basis to expel them, putting people in prisons, in concentration camps and black sites, and then eventually expelling people. And 1.2 million people have been kicked out of their homes in Western Tigray. Because Amhara nationalism, like all settler colonial ideologies, is eliminationist and it's expansionist. And Tigrayan civilians paid the ultimate price for that. I also want to talk about why TPLF, well, it wasn't really TPLF in power, it was EPRDF, which was a 4-party coalition, one representing Tigray, one representing the Amharas, one representing the Oromos, and one representing the Southern peoples kind of collectively. And TPLF was the dominant party in EPRDF. And one of the most critical things that they did was completely rewriting the constitution to where each region had autonomy. It was no longer a requirement to teach public schools in Amharic like it was when my parents were growing up in Tigray. And that was the biggest blow, I think, to Amhara supremacy. And that's partly why the reaction to it all was so lethal. Them having to live under Tigrayan rule for 27 years, it was, I think, maybe this isn't a perfect one-to-one comparison, but the way that we have Trump and the MAGA movement is largely, in my view, their anger of having to live under a black president for 8 years. Very few would say that, but Trump wouldn't exist if they hadn't had to live under a black president for 8 years. Similar to, I don't think Abiy's regime would have functioned the same way if they hadn't had to live under Tigrayan rule and not have Amhara supremacy for 27 years. That, I think, is the crux of it.
Right. And so that goes on, at least open war or in genocide of violent conditions for 2020 to 2022. Mm-hmm. Then we have what's called the Pretoria Peace Agreement.
But I think we need to get into the destruction of Tigray.
Yes.
They completely blocked food, medicine, banking services, wouldn't allow fuel in. People, cancer patients were dying. And under the development that happened under EPRDF rule, they had a pretty decent hospital system. 70% of the hospitals were destroyed. 96% of Tigrayan public school buildings were destroyed. Only 11% of ambulances were working. They were taken to Eritrea. A lot of the looting came from the Eritrean forces. The manufacturing industry, some factories employed, 8,000 people, destroyed. When the war started in November 2020, it was harvest season. So what they did was burned all the crops, had a complete scorched earth policy, just, broke the farm equipment. None of it had any military purpose, of course. It was about destroying Tigrayan peoplehood. And I want to read you some of the quotes. One from a man who is in Abiy Ahmed's cabinet. He's still a social affairs advisor. WNA, which is another term for Tigray, the Tigrayan movement, Tigrayan people, is not something we can understand. We can only erase it. For instance, in Australia, there is an island called Tasmania, which is found in southern Australia. They have destroyed the Tasmanian race. Only one person. They have completely wiped them out. It is only by wiping them out, as I said before, is wiping the disease, the existence of the disease called Wayaniness, Tigrayness. Firstly, so it may not exist physically. Secondly, the very idea, the Wayaniness must never exist, even in the form of an idea. So it wasn't even just about killing Tigrayans, it was about erasing our memory. There were mayors, I don't know if he was Oromo or Amhara, one of them, who said Tigrayans are worse than the devil himself. There are generals, retired generals from the Ethiopian army, who said that Tigrayans using terms like the enemy, sickness, a cancer, talking about TPLF, but TPLF is a code for Tigrayans, for all these nationalists.
Right, like Hamas's means all Palestinians, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. They use it as, they bombed a building because they said TPLF could have been there. They bombed a kindergarten in Mekelle. Mekelle is the capital. So it's very clear. And I think people know that deep down, but there are many who just say, oh no, I have nothing against Tigrayans. I hate TPLF. That's a red flag.
Yeah, and another commonality is the use of food as a weapon, or withholding food as a weapon.
Yeah.
And that's sort of, these conditions, this is sort of why it's a problem when the Biden administration, for instance, says, we don't see any human rights violations, let's normalize relations with Ethiopia again.
It is the same thing, because also you have to keep in mind that Ethiopia is the number one partner entrusted for security reasons in the Horn. Ethiopia is one of the most important allies in Africa. So it's very difficult to argue under those conditions, to argue for that human rights abuses or even genocide are committed by the state that America backs.
Yeah, and so that kind of, I guess, sets the table for the Pretoria Agreement, which was supposedly a peace agreement, but which has not been.
So it is great in theory. I think there are a lot of problems with the way it was constructed. I think it's good that on paper they're saying aid should be let in. I also think it's an issue that Eritrea, who committed majority of the sexual violence, over 130,000 women were raped for days at a time. Sometimes they would stick objects up women. And a purpose of that was they kept repeating, a Tigrayan womb shall never birth again. When the Amhara rapists raped Tigrayan women, they said, we're erasing your Tigrayness. We're Amharanizing you. They said we have to erase these people. So that kind of explains the particular targeting of women of childbearing age, although women of all ages, including children, were targeted.
And so where are we now? I've seen, and what was it, Martin Plot? He, on his blog, I saw there concerns about the split in the TPLF currently that, could lead to maybe more unstable conditions. Where are we at currently with this?
So the problem is the interim president of the Tigray region, Getachew, is a completely non-functioning person. He's an alcoholic, and he completely sold us out. He now works for Abiy. He said that TPLF was responsible for the genocide. And so there's a lot of split. Also, a lot of people that I organize with want to make it a priority to have Eritrea be its independent country. I don't think that's viable. I think that that's deluded, frankly. It's not going to happen. But there are ways we can improve the conditions we're living in Ethiopia. A lot of people want Ethiopia to Balkanize. I think Oromo nationalists have said this for a long time. They've never felt Ethiopian. They've always resisted learning Amharic. But I think maybe because we're also Semitized people, while we were... there are other points in history. In 84, the hunger that was happening in Ethiopia, the Durg did collective punishment and withheld federal aid towards Tigrayans to punish them for TPLF activities. But it's never been this bad, and we didn't think, for example, we don't identify as Ethiopian anymore. My whole life I was Ethiopian. I went to Ethiopian school growing up, very culturally. But a lot of us don't want to identify with Ethiopian Empire, and we never understood when we heard Oromo people and Oromo activists saying, Ethiopia is an empire. We don't want to be part of the empire anymore. We want to be our own people. And we never understood it until the genocide happened. It was never for us. It was an Amhara empire. That's what Ethiopia is. Even if we're probably the most culturally similar to Amharas than any other ethnic group. But it's really, really difficult.
It seems like such a difficulty of nationalism, where you have these two leaders on either side of Tigray who benefit from a, basically, like you said, boogeyman to be able to exercise power. And that, and of course, something like that, you're going to lead to some sort of desire for balkanization. It's a sort of curse of nationalism a little bit.
But the deep indoctrination of, I don't want to say all Eritreans, because, some of our allies are Eritrean. I have family that are Eritrean. But the ones who support the PFDJ, the one who supports Isaias, you have to make that distinction. It's a cult. It's like North Korea or MAGA on steroids. The deification of Isaias as he kills hundreds of thousands of people, strips away their rights. My mom's an interpreter and she interprets from Eritrean refugees every day. We hear these stories every day. The jealousy of how Tigray was thriving while they were suffering under EPRDF, that's why much of the looting came from the Eritrea. All of the Amharas looted too, but they were not in the economic need for looting wasn't as great for the Amharas because they have, had control of the state since the 1200s. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
I want to talk about this sort of the same topic. So like this issue of who can we pressure on this? And part of me seems just like it's obvious thing with Israel too, which is that when there are gross human rights violations, you do not maintain a structure of aid towards the countries that are responsible for that. I mean, is that the big sort of thing we can do here, or what
America is a historic ally because they gain so much security? Because some of the militant groups like Al-Shabaab, Ethiopia was fighting these kinds of groups that presented at least somewhat of a threat to the West. Also, Ethiopia is majority Christian, has a state Orthodox church, unlike every other country in the Horn other than Eritrea. So there's an alliance there. And I think not everyone agrees with me with this next assessment, but I think the deification of Ethiopia, the exotic people, the smart people, the people who have culture, and all the kind of divide and conquer that I think comes in white supremacy. I think the deification of what Ethiopia is and what Ethiopia represents to people, to the Pan-African community, to people in the West, it made them less likely to believe they could do these things. And I think that's a part of the problem, is you're putting kind of this idealism over humanity and human life.
As if they didn't think they, as Ethiopians, could sit back and allow that sort of violence to take place, or?
Yeah, I don't think a genocide on this scale has never happened. Also what's important to keep in mind is Abiy Ahmed didn't just come, like supposedly he came off the back of the Oromo youth movement, but he was placed there. Abiy Ahmed was highly involved in the American security apparatus. So he's their boy. They placed him there partly because it's a proxy conflict with China. Because under EPRDF, there was these phenomenal strides, phenomenal developments economically. There were 2 universities when EPRDF took control. They added 40 more. They completely transformed the public school systems in Ethiopia. Tons and tons of dams were built. Infrastructure was developing. And that's partly because of China's investment. China was investing heavily, but also offering low interest loans. And the need to get rid of Meles and replace him with someone else is also kind of a proxy conflict with China, because they don't want China to have a stronghold in Africa. China was helping tremendously and they couldn't have it. And I don't think they knew everything Abiy was capable of and the genocide he was planning to commit on the Tigrayan people. But when they knew, they didn't care. I didn't want to vote for Biden because of the pictures of him hugging the butcher of my family. Abiy Ahmed watching a soccer game with him, being so conciliatory towards him. Blinken failed us more than anyone else. The over-the-top congratulatory, conciliatory way that they treat Abiy wasn't necessary for them to even maintain the relationship, and they did anyway. And every dead Tigrayan baby, they are complicit in. The world is complicit in. The people who gave him the Nobel Peace Prize and didn't revoke it knowing what he was doing, they are complicit in what happened. Every child in Tigray that's walking around without limbs, they are complicit in it.
I mean, they are the type of folks who would not care about that in relation to their actual policies. And it's interesting to bring up the China thing, because I was wondering about, the proximity to the Red Sea and America's interests in maintaining trade through the world. And that's all the motive that America typically needs to say, yep, I don't see any human rights violations there.
The destruction they plopped up Abiy Ahmed because they wanted EPRDF to be destroyed. He's the most pro-America person probably in the parliament at the time. He believed in neoliberalism. The EPRDF were socialists. I don't think they believed in like the government owning the means of production or anything, but their policies were much more aligned with some of China's policies. America likes neoliberalism. They view it as countries developing. That was the kind of justification, at least on paper, for going into Vietnam. We have to prevent the spread of communism. America and American empire doesn't want anything that could interfere with their world order. And that's part of the reason why Abiy is here. And it scares me because he's only in his 40s, so he could live with the destruction of Tigray for 40 more years. There's still the Amhara militant group Fano that is also responsible for some of the atrocities towards Tigrayans are now blocking from the Afar region that also borders Tigray and the Amhara region aid trucks that international organizations are sending. So he is still trying to destroy Tigray. And what's even more concerning is there's now been a conflict in Amhara. He's been bombing them. You hear all this stuff about, oh, there was no Tigray genocide. There's the Amhara genocide. There's no genocide. I cry for every civilian in Amhara who lost their lives. But it wasn't a genocide in the way that structurally to destroy the Amhara people as a civilization as it was in Tigray. Part of why there was conflict between Amhara nationalists and the federal government now, because, oh, by the way, the Oromos have completely taken back the levers of power now, is in a response to them losing control of the parliament, of many levers of power in the government, but also their anger that they didn't finish Tigray. He worked with the Amhara establishment in order to get revenge for taking their power for 27 years. And now they're getting it too because their militant groups began fighting with the federal government. And now he wants to take Eritrea and take the port of Assab, a really important port at the coast of Eritrea. And so he wants to work with TPLF now, after everything he's done, to take that back. And many people want to mend the relationships between the Eritrean military and the Eritrean groups for the sake of survival now. And I have mixed feelings about it personally, but
doesn't seem like there's a lot of great options on that.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be pragmatic. That's all we can do at this point. But
exactly. If there's anything else you wanted to share before we let you go, you also have 2 links for folks.
Yeah, one is the New Lines Institute, an organization that talks about armed conflict and genocide and stuff. And the other is Omna Tigray, the best Tigrayan advocate site. You can learn about the conflict, you can see where to donate, and the donations are going to go to people who really need it. But I want to end with what justice for Tigray might look like and why the world failed so spectacularly. I think we have to start with why they failed. The Western people within, Western countries, you'll see Macron, you'll see all these people cozying up to him because that kind of same apparatus put him in power in the first place, and he's watching over their neoliberal interests. So it's very difficult for them. That's part of why they refused to make the genocide determination. Blinken refused to make the genocide determination because they wanted to pursue diplomacy with Ethiopia. Many, many sources are saying that. Also, there was so much, our genocide has so many other features, has so many similarities with other genocides. Rwanda, Gaza, Serbia. But what's different is there's a huge infrastructure in denying it. There are to confuse the public. Like, for example, activists at the height of the genocide went on the Breakfast Club with Charlemagne and spoke about it. And then they said, we need to have the other side. And they had, Amhara nationalists and the father of, what's that rapper that was killed?
Oh, that's a good question.
The Eritrean one, I'm blanking on his name, but his father went on the Breakfast Club to deny the genocide what happened. They said that women who were raped, who were intentionally given HIV, all the things that happened, they were paid actors. And then Charlemagne said, now I don't know the truth. And he never spoke about Tigray again.
Oh, Nipsey Hussle, I didn't know that.
Nipsey Hussle, yeah, his father went on the Breakfast Club to deny the Tigray genocide. And and also, have you heard of Breakthrough News with Rania Khalek?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
so. She and this guy called Eugene Pryor went on to say that there were no Eritreans in Tigray. There's no genocide. It's a lot of the No More movement that they created with Harmala Aragawi, a total propagandist, and the Candace Owens of the Tigrayan community. That's what I said do you remember when I called in a couple times?
Yeah.
And that's what she is. There is so much infrastructure built in confusing the public about the genocide. Tigrayans are terrorists. Tigrayans brought it on themselves. Tigrayans are trying to destroy Ethiopia and then are now playing the victim. And they called it an anti-imperialist struggle. They said imperialist voices are making up fake charges of genocide to destroy Ethiopia as an empire. And they were taking advantage of plenty of other times where Western imperialist forces have intervened, and they're taking advantage of that to cover up their own genocidal crimes. What I think would bring about justice and peace for the people of Tigray is, number one, a genocide determination. The Armenian genocide took 100 years, but I wrote in one of my articles that I believe that it won't take as long. A removal of Abiy Ahmed, a removal of the PFDJ movement and Isaias from Eritrea, and healing and reconciliation. And also, the ICC should get involved. There were many, many instances where they over-prosecuted African leaders for their own interests, for their own regime change interests, but now they're looking the other way on a genocide because it suits them to keep Abiy Ahmed in power. And the de-radicalization and the healing of the Eritrean people. There was no safety and no peace and no justice for Tigrayans if we continue to have that on our borders. And there's a giant mental health crisis in Tigray. It was never cultural for people to commit suicide in Ethiopia, and now it's common. A violent crime, things like kidnappings. My cousins who grew up there never had to worry about it, and now they worry about children being kidnapped and kidnapped for ransom. There's so much of a crisis that needs to be healed. There's only 2 psychiatrists for 6 million people. So there's a lot of healing, but it's difficult to have healing without justice for what's happened and recognition that it wasn't a war. There are some myths about this conflict. There's a myth that Tigrayans started the war by attacking Western Command when they were completely surrounded, and this was prepared for years. There's a myth that Tigrayans were doing this to take back control of the government. No, they knew what Abiy was, and they willfully gave up power in 2018, the whole coalition. He came in through the EPRDF coalition under the Oromo banner, and then burned it down behind him, and now has the Prosperity Party, which is autocracy. He wants to be a king, and he said that openly. It's difficult to get justice with that in power.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of issues to deal with there before we're even close to that. Well, we will have those links, and in addition to your Twitter profile, which is Hannah Habtu, just on. Are you on Blue Sky as well?
I am. I haven't really started on it, but I thought that it would be a nice break from all the Nazis that Elon unleashed on us.
Yeah, I know. I want to, put that more into my habit as well.
And especially like the anti-Semitic comments I get too, and like.
It's Nazi o'clock over on Twitter these days. It's a shame that that's the social network that's thriving still, but probably not for. I can't see even.
But many death threats I've received from my organizing from Oromos and from nationalists and Eritrean supporters of the regime who are, it's a transnational cult, who are committing crimes on behalf of the regime in Tel Aviv, in Sweden, in America. And it's something that has to be broken down if there's ever going to be peace.
Absolutely. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us a voice.
Of course. Thank you so much.
I'm a big fan of you and Majority Report.
Oh, thank you so much.